And there is an amazing history between psychedelic drugs and networked computing, but unfortunately I won't be able to go into that today, maybe in the discussion. I want to tell you where and when and why I first heard about the blockchain, and it was when I was buying illegal drugs from the darknet. That was for my last book. The problem that many people have when they're trying to purchase illegal drugs from the internet is that when you use your credit card or any other type of sort of commonly used transaction, when you're doing it on the internet, of course you leave a trace. You leave identification about who you are, including your credit card details, which isn't very wise. And actually, at the very beginning of internet-based drugs trading, people were actually using their credit cards to buy these drugs. Terrible idea. Now, most of you have probably heard of Bitcoin. Back in 2009, there was this idea in a cryptocurrency forum by a strange individual who called himself Satoshi Nakamoto about creating a sort of digital currency, a distributed digital currency. Now, this idea had been knocking around for a very long time indeed. People have been talking about digital currencies since at least the 1980s. David Chaum, a brilliant cryptographer, talked about it and even tried to invent one. The problem with digital currencies, obviously very efficient, very quick, very smooth. The problem was that if you ever tried to create a digital currency, you'd have to work out a way of managing the system. If I want to send somebody some kind of transaction online, usually it's a string of numbers or letters, and that can be very easily copied and then reused, which means for a currency system that doesn't really work very well. Some people played around with creating a sort of centralized ledger system, but people worried that that would always be manipulated. And what Satoshi Nakamoto came up with was this revolutionary idea, which he called the blockchain. And the idea was simply this. I could send a single line of numbers to somebody else. If I could then record that on a sort of a database, me or an address under my name had sent a certain amount of currency to you. It showed then that you had that currency, and then you sent some currency to somebody else, and then somebody else sent that currency to somebody else, and we're all doing transactions. What he worked out was a way of being able to distribute the checking mechanism of that. So a lot of different computers on the network that had the software would verify the transactions between us, would then create a sort of snapshot of those transactions, which he called a block, and then that would be reduced to a hash, and then after about a few minutes of transactions, that would then be stored on a database that every single person who downloaded the software would be able to access and check. So it was very, very difficult to fraudulently change or to manipulate. And the only other way that this sort of system could continue was that single hash, which recorded all of our transactions, was sort of frozen in time, and then a new block of transactions would take place, but they could only take place if they followed on from what the system thought everybody had at the time that that first block of transactions was recorded. Does that make sense? I know it's a kind of complicated system to describe, but the simplest way, really, of describing it is that we can all see all the transactions that all of us make to each other. We can all verify them. We can make sure they're accurate. And we can't really manipulate them or change them. Now, this actually was first for the currency, and that's why everybody used it on the illegal marketplaces that I was talking about. But pretty soon afterwards, and this is where I first kind of started thinking about the revolutionary potential of this, people were saying, well, this isn't actually just about currencies. What we've created is essentially a distributed database that anybody can enter information on, that stores information chronologically, but that cannot be deleted, it cannot be manipulated by a central party, it cannot be censored, it cannot be changed. But everybody can see it. That's actually pretty bloody revolutionary. And when I first started thinking about this, I thought, wow, massive, open, public database of transactions, a chronological order of transactions. It could be anything that anyone can enter onto, but nobody can censor or manipulate. And the more I started thinking about this, the more excited and the more nervous I became. And I thought, what are the kind of really big, really sort of enormous changes this might mean, this might herald for society? Well, the first thing is the end of censorship. It's not really possible with a distributed system like this, a distributed database that everyone can download a copy of themselves onto their own computers, onto their own software. You can't really control information. That's actually pretty terrifying, because governments have always relied on being able to control, one way or another, certain types of information, whether it's your medical records, whether it's illegal propaganda, illegal pornography, whatever it happens to be. There's always been a way for governments to try to control certain types of information. Just imagine for a second a world where censorship from central authorities is no longer possible. It's pretty staggering. And that is one of the things that I think the blockchain genuinely will herald. It might take a while, but I think it will herald that. And that's a staggering change, absolutely staggering. Now, the internet, of course, has made censorship more difficult in many respects, but it hasn't made it impossible. But I think the blockchain could actually make censorship impossible. Now, about 2 years ago, I met a man called Peter Kirstein. Has anyone ever come across this guy? No one knows him. He's a professor at Imperial College, and he was the first man in the UK ever on the internet. In fact, he ran the UK's internet node for about 7 years, single-handedly. He set up one of the first email addresses ever used in the UK was Queen Elizabeth's. And he set that up for her. I think she's got this amazing email address, like queen@something-or-other.com. It's brilliant. He set up the UK's first internet node. He was the first person on the internet for a very long time. I went and interviewed him, and I said, what did you think when you first got online? What were you imagining this internet would be like? Of course, back then it was the ARPANET. It was slightly different, but it was the forerunner of the internet. And he said, well, we had no idea what it would become. We were academics. We were academics, often with ties to the US military. We were interested in creating some kind of system for other academics to be able to share data quickly and easily, and to share computing power, which at the time was incredibly expensive. So none of us had a clue what it would become. And this is one of the interesting things, and I think if you sort of trace the history, the recent history of the internet, you might see in that something similar that will happen with the blockchain, i.e., firstly, we don't really know where it's going to end up. Now, what happened with the internet was, of course, it started off as this academic project, a military academic project, started getting picked up by universities, and students really wanted to use it because it was amazing and it was fun. And so it became a bit of an academic project. There were great discussions and debates about who should build and run the infrastructure, all the pipes and all the rest of it that were needed. US academic community funded a huge amount of it. Then commercial companies really came on board, particularly in the early 90s. It became an amazing vehicle for e-commerce. And then, of course, we built social media on top of the internet in the noughties, and that is the principal way most of us now use it. And you say to Peter Kirstein, did you ever imagine any of this? He says, I still can't believe this is how it ended up. We thought no one would want to use it. And I think we might see something very similar here. Now, I see within the blockchain community, and we've got people here who know far more about the technicalities of it than I do, but I see possibly 4 slightly different communities of people behind this, or who are interested in it, and who use this amazing piece of software. The first is financial services. Probably some of you are involved in this in some ways, but for those groups, they see an amazing opportunity to really improve the efficiency of the way they store information and manage transactions. It's very quick, it's distributed, it's relatively cheap. This could sort of turbocharge the way financial services work. Then you have the anarchist community. There's a huge number of people who think that actually the blockchain is all about overthrowing governments and creating new, wonderful, digital, utopian, libertarian states. And that was always actually part of the Bitcoin plan. Bitcoin has always had this interesting dilemma between those who want to use it to improve market efficiencies and those who want to use it to essentially to try to overthrow governments, to wrestle control of the money supply away from governments. Then I think you'll have people who'll be imagining, how can we use blockchain for social good, to improve transparency of services? And they'll be trying to work out ways that they can use this to really encourage public engagement, to make things more open and more transparent. And then, of course, you'll have governments who'll see, and there was a recent report from the Chief Scientific Officer about how it could be an amazing new way of storing public information, notarizing services, for example. Wonderful. Now, each of these groups will see blockchain in quite a different way. And at times there'll be overlaps between the interests that they share, and at times they will radically diverge. There'll be times when governments will be at loggerheads with the anarchists. There'll be times when the financial services people will be at loggerheads with the people trying to use it for social good. But all of whom, and this is the kind of interesting thing, will be interested in the same technology. It's a dual-purpose technology like everything. And I can see these 4 different strands of thinking almost going off in their own directions, coming back periodically and having enormous bust-ups and arguments about who really controls blockchain and what it's really for. And the final thing I want to say, I know I'm almost out of time, I have acknowledged that, don't worry, is the way that, because it's so disruptive, how it interlinks with existing institutions, particularly the law. There's a really interesting case with Bitcoin. But do you remember when Mt. Gox lost a huge amount of people's cryptocurrency? Huge amounts. And everybody suddenly went to government saying, can you get our Bitcoin back, please? We've lost it. And the governments were saying, well, no. This is nothing to do with us. This is not fiat. You hate fiat currencies. Don't come to us asking for us to replace your Bitcoin. Because Bitcoin was always meant to operate outside nation states. But when there was a problem, of course, people reverted back to the nation states asking for things to be resolved for them. One of the most powerful things I think about blockchain is the ability to create these sort of immutable public records, a list of information, transactions chronologically recorded on these public databases, and that may be things like proof of ownership. I want to be able to prove that I have transferred something in my ownership to something in your ownership. We have both signed that with our digital keys, and we can now verify that both of us are happy with that transaction, and this now belongs to you rather than belongs to me. This is so powerful because it can really remove a huge amount of bureaucracy in transactions between people. This is one of the reasons for those involved in markets, this is a really powerful mechanism. And yet, is proof of a transaction on a blockchain going to stand up in a court of law? If people are unhappy with how it goes, the first thing they'll do, of course, is then say, well, actually, I didn't really want to give it to you. Can I have it back, please? And they'll go to a court of law. How on earth will a judge, many of whom don't really know how the internet works exactly, begin to determine whether the digital transaction that took place on this distributed ledger between 2 people signed off by a digital signature is significant and demonstrable proof of ownership? It's completely, I have no idea. But blockchain is going to have to confront these challenges. It's going to have to, for the time being at least, work within the system that we already have. And I have no idea at all how that's going to happen. I think one of the biggest things for everybody to look out for is the first legal case in the UK where proof of ownership verified on a blockchain is tested. where that decision goes is going to have a huge implication, I think, for how this technology is picked up by society. It's been very brief. I know I've jumped around a lot, but I hope that gives you something of an overview about what this technology is, what it might be able to achieve, and frankly, how little we still know about how it's going to impact society. Thank you very much.